A huge slice of the price on a bottle of famous Scotch is not whiskey at all. It is advertising campaigns, celebrity ambassadors, heavy glass, velvet boxes, and airport billboards. You drink none of it. Today, I am counting down 13 Scotches that flip that equation. Bottles with no marketing budget, no fancy packaging, and no brand tax, where nearly every dollar goes into the liquid itself. Some come from grocery stores. One comes from a distillery you cannot even name. And number 1 might be the best deal in all of Scotch right now. Number 13, Aerstone Sea Cask. William Grant & Sons owns Glenfiddich and Balvenie, two of the most heavily marketed single malts on earth. Airstone is what happens when that same company builds a whiskey with the marketing switched off. It was created in 2018 specifically to sit on supermarket shelves, made at their quiet Ailsa Bay distillery and matured in warehouses on the Ayrshire coast. There was no launch party and no glossy campaign, because the entire point of the brand was to compete on shelf price against store labels. Grant simply could not do that with Glenfiddich without wrecking its premium image, so they built a second door into the same house. The label does not even try to charm you. It just says, smooth and easy. And that is exactly what pours out. Creamy vanilla, shortbread, honeyed malt, and a whisper of coastal salt on the finish. Here is the part that matters. This is a true 10-year-old single malt from one of the great whiskey families, and it sells for around $35. Balvenie charges you double that before the age statement even catches up. Same parent company, same blending team overseen by master blender Brian Kinsman, the man who signs off on Glenfiddich itself. One of them just skipped to the advertising department. And in a category where nearly every budget bottle hides its youth behind a blank label, an honest 10-year age statement at this price is quietly remarkable. If you have a smoky tooth, its sibling Lancask uses Highland peat for the same money. Either way, you are drinking Grant family whiskey without paying the Grant family toll. Number 12, Kirkland Signature 12-year blended Scotch. Yes, the Costco one. Before you laugh, look at what is actually in the bottle. This is a 12-year-old blended Scotch sourced by Alexander Murray, an independent bottling company founded in 2004 by a Scottish expat, and it carries roughly 25% malt whiskey in the blend. A typical supermarket blend runs between 10 and 15% malt. So Costco quietly gives you nearly double the good stuff with a full 12-year age statement in a giant 1.75-litre bottle for around $40 to $50. That works out to a per-pour price that famous blends cannot touch. Forbes rated it among the top tier of blended whiskies on the market and called it an exceptional value. There is no distillery tour, no heritage story, and no tin. There is just a warehouse palate and a surprisingly complex whiskey with brown sugar, dried fruit, cinnamon, and a wisp of smoke. The profile was deliberately modelled on Dewar's, the best-selling blended Scotch in America, so it slots straight into the highball or rocks pour you already make. The lesson is the same one Costco teaches with everything else in the store. Strip the name off the front, and suddenly the contents have to do the talking. Number 11. Banknote 5-year-old. This one looks like it was labelled by an accountant, which is fitting because it treats your money with more respect than almost any blend in the store. Banknote is put together by A.D. Rattray, an independent Scottish firm with roots going back to 1868, and the specs read like a cheat sheet, a real 5-year age statement when rivals hide behind no statement at all, bottled at 43% instead of the legal minimum. And a blend recipe of 40% malt whiskey to 60% grain, the same malt ratio found in far more expensive household names. The price for all of that is around $20, and in many stores that buys you a full 1-litre bottle. It tastes of honey, vanilla and buttered toast, clean and mellow with no rough edges. The name itself is a revival of a Victorian-era blend once shipped out of Glasgow by James Sword and Company, back when whiskey barrels were loaded straight onto cargo ships on the Clyde. Nobody is paying an ambassador to pour this at festivals, and nobody is buying billboards in airport lounges. That is precisely why it costs what it costs and why it has become a quiet cult pick among drinkers who mix often and refuse to pour paint thinner. Number 10. Tamnavulin Double Cask. Tamnavulin is owned by White and Mackay, the same company behind Dalmore. Think about how those two brands are treated. Dalmore gets the crystal decanters, the silver stag, and the luxury boutique placement. Tamnavulin gets a plain bottle and a spot near the bottom shelf. Yet, the whiskey inside is a legitimate Speyside single malt from a distillery that has been running on the banks of the River Livette since 1966, matured in American oak and finished in sherry casks. It sells for around $30 in the US, and in British supermarkets it regularly drops close to $20. You get apple, toffee, honey, and marzipan with a soft sherry sweetness. Is it complex enough to meditate over for an hour? No. Is it better than its price by a wide margin? Absolutely. The name means mill on the hill in Gaelic, after the old carding mill that still sits on the site. And for decades, nearly everything made here vanished silently into blends. The Double Cask was the distillery's first proper single malt release since the 90s, which is why almost nobody has heard of it. One company, two strategies. With Dalmore, you fund the stag on the bottle. With Tamnavulin, you just buy whiskey. Number 9. Finlaggan Old Reserve. Here is the strangest bargain in Scotch. Finlaggan is a heavily smoky single malt from a small windswept island off the west coast of Scotland, the one whose famous distilleries charge $60 to $100 a bottle. The Vintage Malt Whiskey Company buys casks from one of those famous distilleries and refuses to tell you which one. No name means no brand premium, and the price collapses to around $20 to $30, with Trader Joe's often selling it near the bottom of that range. Whiskey forums have spent years arguing over the source, guessing at the biggest names on that island, because the smoke, brine, and medicinal character taste suspiciously like bottles costing 3 times as much. It is young, and it makes no attempt to hide that. What you are tasting is essentially the raw, new blood of a famous distillery, before the accountants decided it was old enough to wear the expensive label. The name comes from the ruined castle on that island where the Lords of the Isles once ruled the western seaboard, and the company insists the whiskey has always come from one single distillery, which only fuels the guessing game. You give up the label bragging rights and the age statement. You keep the campfire smoke, the sea spray, and about 40 saved dollars. For a nightly smoky pour, that trade is not even close. Number 8. Timorous Beastie. Douglas Lang has been an independent Glasgow whisky house since 1948, and Timorous Beastie is their Highland blended malt, named after the field mouse in the Robert Burns poem. Ignore the cartoon mouse on the label, because the contents are dead serious. This is 100% malt whiskey, no grain filler at all, drawn from Highland distilleries, including the ones behind Dalmore, Glengoyne, and Glengarioch. It is bottled at 46.8%, with no added colouring and no chill filtration, which are the exact specs whiskey nerds beg the big brands to adopt. The price sits around $35 to $40. Pour it and you get an oily, mouth-coating dram full of honey, vanilla, orchard fruit, and warm baking spice. Several of the distilleries inside this bottle sell their own single malts for twice the money. Douglas Lang simply is not charging you for their logos. Blended malt is arguably the most underrated category in all of Scotch, precisely because it lacks a single famous distillery name to advertise, so the whole category trades at a discount. This bottle is the easiest way to exploit that gap, and if you fall for the style, the 10-year-old version adds an age statement for only a little more. Number 7. Wolfburn Northland. Wolfburn is the northernmost distillery on the Scottish mainland, sitting outside the town of Thurso, where a tiny team revived a name that had been dead for around 150 years and started distilling again in 2013. There is no visitor centre empire and no global campaign, just a small crew making spirit by hand and maturing it in quarter casks that previously held heavily peated whiskey from that same famous smoky island in the west. The result is Northland, bottled at 46%, non-chill, filtered and natural in colour, usually between $40 and $60. It tastes of honeyed malt, green apple, sea air and a gentle drift of smoke sitting quietly behind the sweetness. The quarter casks matter here because the smaller barrel puts more wood in contact with every litre of spirit and matures it faster, which is how a young distillery punches above its age. Every dollar of that price funds barley, casks and payroll for actual whiskey makers rather than a media agency in London. Supporting a bottle like this also keeps genuinely independent distilleries alive in an industry dominated by a handful of corporations. Real quick before number 6, because the back half of this list is where the serious bottles live. If you find breakdowns like this useful, hit subscribe and drop your own no marketing hidden gem in the comments. I go through the comments after every video and half of my future bottle lists start there. Back to the countdown. Number 6, Royal Lochnagar 12. This is the smallest distillery in the entire Diageo empire, producing less than 500,000 litres a year in the shadow of Balmoral Castle. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert visited in 1848, liked what they tasted, and granted the royal warrant that still sits on the label. Here is why it belongs on this list. A large share of Royal Lochnagar's tiny output disappears into Johnnie Walker Blue Label, a blend that sells for around $200, largely on the strength of its packaging and prestige. The single malt itself, the actual source liquid, sells for around $55 to $70 depending on where you shop, with barely a whisper of promotion. It is a gentle, elegant Highland dram of apple, honey, toffee and soft spice, made with 2 tiny stills and old-fashioned worm tub condensers in a granite farm steading that has barely changed in a century. So you have a choice. Pay $200 for the blue box and the velvet pouch, or pay a quarter of that and drink from the same well. Number 5. Glen Elgin 12. Ask professional blenders which malts they rank as top class, and Glen Elgin comes up again and again. Ask a regular whiskey drinker and you will usually get a blank stare. That gap is the whole opportunity. Glen Elgin was built in 1898, the final project of Charles Doig, the architect who invented the pagoda roof you see on distilleries everywhere. Nearly all of its production vanishes into the White Horse blend, so Diageo has never spent a meaningful pound promoting it as a single malt. The 12-year-old is the only permanent official bottling at 43%, made with slow 80-hour fermentations and old-fashioned worm tub condensers that give the spirit real weight. In Britain it sells for around £45. In America it is genuinely scarce and usually runs $65 to $80 when a store bothers to stock it, which tells you exactly how little effort anyone makes to sell this whiskey. It drinks like honeyed fruitcake, waxy and full with tangerine, sultanas and toasted almonds. Blenders have quietly treasured this liquid for a century. The public just never got the memo. Number 4. Glenglassaugh 12. Glenglassaugh on the label, this coastal distillery near Sandend Bay was founded in 1875 and then spent most of its life either closed or invisible, mothballed from 1986 all the way to 2008. It shares an owner with Glendronach and Ben Riach, and it has always been the forgotten sibling that never got the spotlight. In 2023, master blender Rachel Barry rebuilt the range around a proper 12-year-old matured in bourbon, sherry and red wine casks in warehouses overlooking the North Sea, bottled at a healthy 45% for around $65. Then its sister bottling Sandon went and won Whiskey of the Year from a major American whiskey magazine, and suddenly the whole lineup started disappearing from shelves. The 12 gives you butterscotch, stone fruit, nutty toffee, and a faint coastal salt picked up from decades of sea air rolling through those warehouses. You are buying award season liquid from a name your friends still cannot pronounce. That mispronunciation is your discount, and it will not last forever. Number 3, Gordon and MacPhail. This is not one bottle. It is a loophole. Gordon and MacPhail started in 1895 as a grocery shop in Elgin, and while the big distillers spent the 20th century pouring everything into blends, this family firm quietly bought casks, matured them in its own warehouses, and bottled them under its own plain labels. Their Connoisseur's Choice series, launched in 1968 by George Urquhart, is widely credited with introducing consumers to single malt Scotch at a time when the industry only cared about blends. Here is how the loophole works today. A distillery's official bottling carries its full brand premium. A Gordon and MacPhail bottling of whiskey made at that same distillery often costs meaningfully less, or delivers far better specs at the same money with the cask type, age, and source distillery printed honestly on the label. Their entry-level discovery range starts around $50 to $60. You are buying famous liquid wearing a grocer's label. The grocer just happens to be the most respected independent bottler on the planet. Number 2, Ben Nevis 10. Ask serious whiskey drinkers to name a cult distillery, and Ben Nevis comes up with a knowing smile. Founded in 1825 at the foot of Britain's highest mountain in Fort William, it has been owned since 1989 by the Japanese distiller Nikka, and a large slice of its production quietly ships off into blends. The official range is essentially one whiskey, this 10-year-old at 46%, and the distillery promotes it about as hard as a farmer promotes his tractor. Expect to pay $70 to $90 in America. And note that supply has been tightening because the distillery has been pulling back from selling casks to outside bottlers while demand quietly climbs. It is old-fashioned in the best way, rich and slightly funky, with tropical fruit, dark toffee, walnuts, waxy oils, and a distant thread of smoke. Reviewers keep comparing it to distilleries whose bottles cost twice as much, and its refill cask policy runs completely against modern fashion. There is no gift box and no story about ancient Viking heritage. There is just heavyweight spirit that whiskey insiders have been keeping to themselves for years, and a distillery so unbothered by fame that a large part of its makes sails off to Japan without ever touching a Scottish label. Buy it before the rest of the internet finishes catching on. Number 1. The Signatory 100 Proof Edition. The purest expression of this entire video. Signatory Vintage is an independent bottler based in Pitlochry with more than 10,000 casks in its warehouses, and in late 2023 its founder Andrew Symington did something almost nobody in this industry does anymore. He launched a range engineered to strip out every cost that is not whiskey. Plain white labels, simple bottles, no boxes worth photographing. Inside, single malts from respected distilleries bottled at a full 57.1%, the old 100 proof standard, with natural colour, no chill filtration, and heavy use of first fill sherry casks. In Britain, these sell for around £50, and even after crossing the ocean, they generally land between $60 and $80. Comparable cask strength sherried malts from famous brands run well past $150. Early releases from distilleries like Blair, Athol and Ardmore sold out fast, and the series has since expanded across dozens of distilleries, including mystery malts from Orkney that everyone quietly understands come from a very famous neighbour. The range became one of the most celebrated whiskey series of the past few years, almost entirely by word of mouth, which is fitting. When the product is only liquid, the liquid does the advertising. If you buy one bottle from this entire list, make it one of these, because it is the clearest proof in modern Scotch that quality and price were never actually the same conversation. So there it is. 13 bottles that prove the least glamorous shelf in the store is often hiding the best whiskey per dollar. The pattern behind all of them is simple. marketing is expensive, and somebody always pays for it. Make sure it is not you. If this changed how you look at that bottom shelf, subscribe. More videos like this are already in the pipeline, and I will see you in the next one.